3 months ago, I was the proud owner of a $1.9 million home in Detroit, filled with decades of memories, photographs, my late wife's china, my children's first toys. Today that house is gone, my belongings scattered, and I stand alone with nothing but an old letter pulled from my mother's cedar chest. How did everything I built vanish so quickly? And why would the woman I believed was the gentlest soul alive hide a truth so devastating? Before I tell you what I found, I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if your entire life collapsed overnight? And let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. My name was Harold Bennett. I'm 68 years old, a retired factory worker from Detroit. For nearly 4 decades, I worked the assembly lines building engines and saving for the future I thought I had secured. I wasn't wealthy by Wall Street standards, but I was steady. My wife Mary and I raised 3 children on those wages. After she passed 5 years ago, I told myself that as long as I still had our home, I still had her presence with me. The porch swing where she used to sip iced tea in the evenings. The oak dining table scarred by countless Thanksgiving dinners. Even the dent in the kitchen wall where my son Thomas once kicked a soccer ball too hard. Every corner of that house carried her voice. But when the lawsuit came, filed by my own son and his wife, I watched it all slip through my fingers like sand. They painted me as reckless, said I was addicted to gambling, too unstable to manage my affairs. Lies supported by forged bank statements and witnesses I barely knew. I sat in that sterile courtroom, the judge's gavel echoing like a death knell as everything was stripped away, my property, my reputation, my dignity. Walking out, I felt hollow, as if the man I had been for 68 years had been erased in a single afternoon. Now, I stand in a rented apartment, stripped of the life I knew, holding this one fragile envelope from my mother, Margaret Bennett. She's been gone for over 20 years. All my life, I thought of her as a quiet librarian who stretched every penny, who made meatloaf taste like a banquet and never missed Sunday service. A woman who, despite widowhood and hardship, never complained, never faltered. And yet, in my hands, in the shaky ink of her handwriting, was a secret so enormous it threatened to recast everything I thought I knew about her and about myself. That letter did not feel like comfort. It felt like dynamite waiting to explode. I never imagined that the collapse of my present would drag me back into the shadows of my past. But that's exactly what happened the day I tore open that envelope. When I first held that letter, I couldn't help but think back to the life I believed was steady and secure. For decades, I told myself I had done everything right, that I had built the kind of American dream an ordinary man like me could reasonably hope for. Looking back now, it feels almost unreal, like a film reel I once starred in, but no longer belonged to. I married my high school sweetheart Mary when I was 23. We didn't have much, just a used Chevy, a rented apartment above a corner store, and the determination to build something together. By the time I was 30, we had bought our first little house in Detroit, one of those brick 2-stories with squeaky wooden floors. I remember painting the living room a shade of pale yellow, because Mary swore it made the space feel warmer, even in the bleak Michigan winters. That was our beginning, simple, but filled with the kind of hope you can almost taste in the air. We raised 3 children under that roof. Thomas, the oldest, grew up stubborn and headstrong, always wanting to lead. Eric, quieter, thoughtful, the kind of boy who'd rather fix a broken radio than play outside. And Nancy, our youngest, my little girl with a laugh so bright it could chase away the darkest evening. Nancy moved to Texas after college, carving her own path far from Detroit, but she never stopped calling me Dad, with that same sweet tone, even when months slipped by between our conversations. Life was not glamorous, but it was dependable. I worked at the plant, clocking in before sunrise, the smell of oil and hot metal becoming as familiar as the scent of morning coffee. It was grueling work, but I took pride in it. Every paycheck meant new shoes for the kids, fresh coats of paint on the house, and eventually a small but growing retirement account. Mary stretched each dollar like a miracle worker. Casseroles that lasted 3 nights, bargain clothes that looked brand new, Christmas mornings that somehow felt magical even when the tree leaned crooked. When I finally retired at 65, I imagined my days filled with porch swings, backyard barbecues, and the satisfaction of watching my grandchildren run barefoot through the grass. And for a short while, it seemed that dream was within reach. My Sundays belonged to church, where I ushered and sometimes helped the pastor fix a leaky pipe. Neighbors called me Mr. Bennett with a mixture of respect and affection, because I was always the one with a wrench in hand mowing a widow's lawn or patching a kid's bike tire. I liked being that steady presence the old man people could count on. There were moments, small ones that I clung to. Sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, Mary's hand resting over mine, the news humming quietly in the background. Watching Thomas teach Eric how to drive in the church parking lot, both of them laughing when the car jerked forward. Hearing Nancy's voice over the phone on Christmas Eve promising she'd visit soon. These were not the moments people write headlines about, but they were mine, and I thought they would carry me peacefully into old age. But if I'm honest, even then, there were shadows I ignored. Thomas's ambition sometimes edged into arrogance. Eric's silence hid more than he shared, and Nancy's distance grew longer with each passing year. I brushed it aside, telling myself every family had cracks, that love would hold us together. I believed that as long as I kept the house, kept working hard, kept showing up, nothing could truly collapse. I was wrong. What I didn't know was that beneath the calm surface of my so-called dream, another story was waiting to surface, one that began long before I was old enough to understand it. A story tied not just to me, but to the woman who raised me, and to secrets she buried so deep they would only rise after I had lost nearly everything. If the first act of my life was about building the next, was about watching it all unravel. And yet somehow the seeds of survival had been planted decades before, hidden in ways I could never have guessed. It's strange how quickly a life that feels steady can tilt. One day you're sipping coffee on the porch, waving at neighbors, believing your years of work have bought you a safe landing. The next, you're staring across a courtroom at your own flesh and blood, wondering how the people you raised could twist the knife so deeply. That's how it happened with Thomas. He was my firstborn, the child I once carried on my shoulders through the Detroit Zoo, the boy who broke my back porch window with a baseball and apologized with tears streaming down his freckled face. Somewhere along the way, that boy hardened into a man I barely recognized. His wife, Angela, polished, sharp-tongued, always seemed to push him toward bigger houses, newer cars, more, always more. I didn't pay much mind at first. Parents want to believe their kids are happy. But behind closed doors, discontent was fermenting. It started with subtle remarks. Thomas asking about the value of my house, hinting that maybe I should downsize. Angela suggesting I might be lonely and better off in a nice assisted living place. I laughed it off, refusing to see what was forming beneath their smiles. Then came the paper's legal documents that landed on my doorstep like a thunderclap. They were petitioning the court to declare me incompetent, accusing me of gambling debts, reckless spending, even early dementia. I remember the courtroom smell, old wood polish, stale air conditioning, the faint perfume from Angela's lawyer. They stacked evidence on the table, bank statements with my name, casino receipts I'd never seen, witnesses I barely remembered. One man swore he'd seen me hunched over a slot machine in Windsor, Canada. I haven't crossed that bridge in 15 years. None of it mattered. The attorneys spoke with the calm authority of people who knew they'd already won. I sat silent, my hands trembling on the armrest of the wooden chair, listening as my own son described me as a danger to myself. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Every word felt like a stone against my chest. When the judge finally ruled, her gavel cracked through the room. My home was to be signed over, my accounts placed under guardianship, my rights diminished to almost nothing. At 68 years old, I was officially treated like a man who couldn't be trusted with his own keys. Walking out of that courthouse was like walking out of my own skin. Mrs. Cooper, my neighbor of 40 years, stood on the steps. She clutched her purse, eyes watery, shaking her head in disbelief. "Harold," she whispered, "I can't believe this." Neither could I. I wanted to scream, to tear those papers in half, but all I could do was keep walking, the autumn wind cutting against my face like shards of glass. That night in the one-bedroom apartment I'd rented above a hardware store, the silence pressed in heavy. No creak of floorboards from the old house, no scent of Mary's lavender sachets, no laughter from Nancy calling late on a Sunday. Just me, a worn recliner, and the hollow echo of betrayal. I tried to pray, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you pray when the ones you love most have painted you as a villain? I thought about Thomas's eyes in that courtroom, cold, distant. Was this all his doing, or had Angela poisoned his mind? Part of me wanted to believe he was manipulated, that deep down he still remembered the father who worked overtime to buy his first bike. But another part knew ambition had its claws in him, and he saw me not as his father, but as an obstacle to what he thought he deserved. Betrayal doesn't just break your heart, it erodes your sense of reality. I questioned my own memories, replayed every moment with Thomas trying to find the crack where love turned to greed. But all I found was emptiness. I had lost the house that carried Mary's voice, the yard where my grandchildren once played, and the respect of the very blood that bore my name. What I didn't know then was that this destruction wasn't random. It was part of something larger, something woven long before Thomas was even born. But at that moment, all I could feel was the sting of abandonment, sharper than any wound life had dealt me before. When you lose the ground beneath your feet, the only place left is the soil you started on. After the courtroom and the rented apartment, I found myself driving south through Ohio, back to the street I once swore I'd never return to. Maple Street hadn't changed much in 40 years. Narrow sidewalks, maple trees, shedding gold leaves in the autumn wind, and small ranch houses that looked like they'd been frozen in the 1960s. My mother's house was still there, tucked behind a sagging picket fence, the porch light long dead, but the shape instantly familiar. I stood in the driveway for a long while, engine off, listening to the ticking of the cooling car. The house seemed to breathe with silence. It had been more than 2 decades since I'd last stepped inside at her funeral, when I swore I couldn't bear to return. But grief makes strange promises, and now necessity was dragging me back. The front door creaked exactly as I remembered, a long groan like the house was waking from sleep. Dust hung in the air, visible in the slant of afternoon light. The oak sideboard still held the framed photo of my father in his work shirt, though the glass was clouded. My mother's small wooden cross remained above the mantel, its varnish dulled but still sturdy. On the dining table sat a tin box, the kind she used to fill with oatmeal cookies. Empty now, but the faint scent of cinnamon lingered when I lifted the lid like the ghost of her presence. Every corner was layered with time. Her sewing basket sat open by the armchair needles still tucked in fabric. The bookshelf bowed with weight, Agatha Christie mysteries lined up like old soldiers. I reached for a photo album, its plastic cover yellowed. Inside were snapshots of birthdays, picnics, first days of school. My own awkward grin at 16 stared back at me, a reminder that once life had been simple, ordinary. I wasn't alone for long. A knock startled me, and when I opened the door there, he was Eddie Clark, my childhood friend, older now, but unmistakable. His hair had gone white, his shoulders stooped, but his grin was the same one that once dared me to climb water towers and ride bikes without brakes. "Harold Bennett." He chuckled. I thought I'd seen a ghost. We sat on the porch steps as the sun dipped low. Eddie told me about the neighborhood the Millers moved away. The Johnson boy never returned from Vietnam. Mrs. Patterson still keeping her garden gnomes lined in military rows. He asked about my life, and I gave him the short version, leaving out the raw edges. But Eddie wasn't fooled. He placed a hand on my shoulder, rough from years of carpentry, and said, "You look like a man who's been hit in the gut and hasn't caught his breath yet." He wasn't wrong. I told him I planned to stay just a while, fix the place up, maybe sell it. The words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Something in the way the house held me, the way the past pressed from every wall, told me leaving wouldn't be so simple. Eddie gave me a look, half knowing, half warning. That house, he said, nodding at the old siding, always kept its own secrets. "You sure you're ready to live with them?" I laughed it off. But later alone inside, his words echoed louder than the creak of the floorboards. I thought I was just seeking shelter, a temporary refuge from betrayal. But as I moved through the rooms, I felt it, the weight of something left unsaid, something my mother never told me. It was there in the stillness, in the untouched objects, in the way the basement door seemed to whisper whenever I walked by. That night, lying on the sagging couch with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, I realized Eddie was right. This wasn't just a roof over my head. This house had been waiting for me, holding on to a story that belonged not just to Margaret Bennett, but to me. And before long, I would be forced to hear it. Eddie's warning stayed with me long after he left that night. The house creaked and sighed, as though it held its breath, waiting for me to notice something I'd missed. The next morning, I rolled up my sleeves, determined to clean out the place, if only to keep my mind busy. Dusting shelves and hauling boxes seemed safer than sitting alone with memories. The basement was always my least favorite spot as a kid. Damp air, flickering bulb shadows that stretched too far. I hadn't stepped down those stairs in decades. But when I opened the door and pulled the chain to the single hanging light, I was struck by how little had changed. The same cracked cement floor, the same shelves stacked with jars of peaches my mother canned back in the 70s, their lids rusted with time. Eddie showed up not long after carrying 2 cups of gas station coffee. "Figured you could use a hand," he said. I didn't argue. We set to work clearing out old boxes, Christmas ornaments, broken appliances, yellowed newspapers. Then, against the far wall, tucked behind an old oak cabinet, I noticed something odd. The cabinet didn't quite touch the wall. A draft slipped through the narrow gap, cool against my fingers. "Help me move this," I told Eddie. We grunted, heaving the heavy thing aside. Behind it was a door I'd never seen before. Not a regular door, just a rough wooden panel edges sealed with paint the same color as the wall, as if someone had wanted it hidden. My pulse kicked up. We pried it open with a screwdriver, the wood groaning in protest. What lay beyond was a small space no bigger than a closet, the air inside colder, heavier. At the center sat a safe squat and iron, its surface mottled with rust. Beside it, stacked neatly, were several leather-bound notebooks, and on top of those, a Polaroid photograph. I picked up the photo first. My hands shook when I recognized her, my mother, Margaret. Younger, maybe in her 30s, her smile not the soft one I remembered, but sharper, almost defiant. Standing beside her was a man in a military uniform, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder. I didn't recognize him. His eyes were dark, steady, the kind of gaze that carried weight. Someone important, someone dangerous. Eddie leaned closer, squinting. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "That looks like one of those army boys that used to hang around here back when we were kids." I froze. "What do you mean?" He shrugged uneasily. "Every now and then I'd see cars parked out front late at night. Men I didn't know, short haircuts, stiff postures like they didn't belong on Maple Street. Your mom would shoo me away if I got too curious. I figured maybe she was helping church folks or something. But now..." His voice trailed off. I sat on the cold concrete floor, the photo burning in my hands. The journals beckoned, their spines cracked with age. I opened the first one, the pages filled with my mother's looping script. The words weren't recipes or grocery lists like I expected. They were records, dates, names, places, fragments of conversations, notes about people I'd never heard of, and then my eyes landed on a line that made my stomach drop. "If they come back, Harold must never know until the time is right." I snapped the book shut, heart pounding. My mother, the quiet librarian who spent evenings knitting on the porch, had left behind something that felt less like a diary and more like intelligence work. And the safe, whatever was inside, loomed like a locked mouth, refusing to tell its story. Eddie shifted uneasily, running a hand through his white hair. "Harold, maybe you shouldn't dig too deep." But it was too late for that. The hidden room, the photograph, the journals, every piece screamed that my life and my mother's was not what I thought it was. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, the grief and betrayal I carried were replaced by something else. Raw, gnawing curiosity, and a fear I couldn't quite name. The house wasn't just holding memories, it was holding secrets, and now I had cracked the door open. The journals alone were enough to rattle me, but it was the safe that pulled me like a magnet. The thing sat squat and immovable in the hidden corner, daring me to try. I ran my fingers over the dial, cold metal, rough with rust. 10,000 combinations, I thought, but one number mattered more than any: my birthday. March 7th, 1955. My mother never forgot it. She used to wake me every year at exactly 6:32 a.m., the time I was born. It seemed foolish, but I twisted the dial anyway, right to 03, left to 07, right to 55. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft click cut through the silence. My breath caught as I pulled the heavy door open. Inside was no treasure chest, but the sight stopped me cold. Bundles of cash stacked in faded canvas bags, some bills crisp, others browned at the edges. Later, I would count it more than $400,000. Enough to change a man's life. Though in that moment it felt more like a burden than a blessing. Beneath the money lay documents, driver's licenses, birth certificates, Social Security cards, all bearing my mother's face but under different names. Catherine, Elena, Ruth. Identities she had worn like masks. My throat tightened. This was not the Margaret Bennett I remembered, the woman who clipped coupons, who brought lemon bars to church potlucks, who hummed hymns as she folded laundry. These papers told me she had been someone else entirely, someone I had never truly known. And then I saw the envelope. My name written across the front in her precise script. Harold. Nothing more. My hands shook as I tore it open. The first line made my stomach drop. If you are reading this, it means they have found us, and I am no longer here to protect you. The letter was 3 pages, her words steady but heavy, each sentence cutting deeper. She wrote that my father hadn't died in a car accident, as I'd been told all my life. His name was not Robert Bennett, the factory worker I pictured when I traced his photo with my fingers. His real name was David Carter, and he had been murdered in 1962, shot in an alley in Chicago because of what he knew. He had been tied to a covert network during the Cold War, men who straddled the thin line between patriot and traitor. My mother had witnessed his death. She had been marked to die that same night, but she escaped. With me. In the chaos that followed, she was pulled into the Federal Witness Protection Program. That's when Margaret Bennett was born, replacing the woman she once was. A librarian's salary, a quiet life in Ohio, raising me as though the past could be erased with new wallpaper and a new name. I had to set the letter down. The basement walls pressed closer. My mother, the steady hand that held mine at funerals, the quiet voice that told me God would provide, had been living in the crosshairs of history. And I'd never suspected. She wrote that the money in the safe was the remains of the settlement the government had provided, added to by her own careful savings. But money wasn't the real inheritance. It was the warning. Harold, she wrote, you may think the past has stayed buried, but men who kill to keep secrets never forget. If you are forced back here, it means they are circling again. I read the lines over and over until the words blurred. My father murdered. My mother undercover. My entire life, the product of a lie, meant to keep me breathing. I thought losing my house, my family, my reputation was the bottom. But this was the floor dropping out beneath the bottom. And yet even as fear gripped me, a strange clarity flickered. My mother had carried this weight for decades. Now it was mine. And in some way I didn't yet understand, she had been preparing me for it all along. I sat in that basement for hours, the letter spread across my knees, my chest tight with a mixture of grief and fury. My life, my father's death, even my mother's quiet existence, it had all been shaped by shadows I never knew existed. I thought the betrayal in the courtroom had been the cruelest blow. I was wrong. That was only the echo of a deeper scheme. The first sign came 2 days later. A knock at the door. Not the polite tap of a neighbor, but firm, deliberate. When I opened it, a tall man stood on the porch. His hair was steel gray, his frame lean but strong, dressed in a faded field jacket that spoke of another era. He introduced himself with a voice that carried authority, even softened by age. "Name's George Whitaker," he said. "I knew your mother, Harold. We worked together once long ago." Something in his eyes, steady, unblinking, told me he wasn't lying. I invited him in, though my hands trembled. He looked around the house like he was greeting an old comrade. "She told me if you ever came back, there'd be trouble following close behind. Guess that time has come." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my mother had served pot roast and peach cobbler. George leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The people who killed your father never disappeared. They just changed their methods. Less gunfire, more manipulation. They wait decades looking for weakness in families like yours. Then they move in quietly, destroying from the inside out." My throat went dry. I thought of Thomas, his cold eyes in court, Angela's sharp smile. "You're saying my own family's part of this?" George sighed. not all of them. But Angela, your daughter-in-law, she's been in their pocket for years. They dangled money security, convinced her that aligning with them would guarantee her children's future. She helped them set you up, Harold. Every forged receipt, every false witness, it started with her opening the door. The words struck harder than the gavel that stole my house. Angela. The woman who once kissed my cheek on Christmas morning, who served me coffee in my own kitchen. She had been the lever used to pry my life apart. And Thomas, was he complicit, or simply blinded by loyalty to his wife? I didn't know which answer hurt more. George continued, his voice steady, matter-of-fact, like a surgeon cutting truth from infection. They've been watching since the 60s. Waiting. Your mother held them off by disappearing into another name, another life. But they never stopped hunting. When she died, the only thing left between them and you was time. They needed a way to drag you back here to this house to flush out whatever she left behind. That lawsuit wasn't coincidence, Harold. It was strategy. I leaned back, the chair groaning under me, the room spinning. All those years I thought my quiet, steady life was my own. It had been a stage, a safe house built on borrowed time. And now the curtain was falling. George reached across the table, his hand rough and warm. You've got choices, son. You can run or you can face what's coming. But don't think this is just about you. They're after anything your mother left, names, documents, proof that could burn them even now. And they will use your family, every weakness, every crack to get it. I stared at the letter still lying open beside us. My mother's words burning into me. If they come back, it means they have found you. She hadn't been exaggerating. The storm she outran for decades had circled back to me. The betrayal of my son and daughter-in-law was no longer just a family tragedy. It was a weapon aimed squarely at my history, my bloodline, my very identity. And as George's steady gaze held mine, I realized the courtroom loss had only been the opening move in a game I didn't even know I was playing. George's words hung in the air long after he left, settling into the corners of the old house like dust. I sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the letter, the safe, the photograph of my mother with that mysterious soldier. For years I had told myself my battles were behind me, that retirement meant rocking chairs, birthday parties with grand kids, and quiet evenings. Now I knew the truth. My fight was only beginning. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I walked the rooms of my mother's house, touching the worn edges of furniture, breathing in the scent of old books and cedar. Everywhere I turned, I felt her presence urging me forward. She had carried this secret through decades of solitude. The least I could do was honor it. By dawn, my mind was clear. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to fade quietly into the shadows they tried to push me into. I was going to fight back. The letter had included a phone number scribbled at the bottom, underlined twice. It belonged to a federal contact from the old program, someone who had survived long enough to keep watch. My hands shook as I dialed. The line clicked, then a gravelly voice answered. "This is Agent Samuel Price. Who am I speaking with?" For a moment, I felt like a boy again, caught between fear and defiance. Then I straightened my back. "My name is Harold Bennett, but I think you knew my mother as Margaret. She left me something, and she said you'd understand." There was silence on the other end, followed by a slow, steady breath. "I've been waiting for this call, Harold. Don't say another word over the phone." "Where are you?" Within hours. I was sitting across from a man in his 70s, his hair thin, his suit plain, but his eyes still sharp as glass. He confirmed what George had already hinted: my mother had been part of a witness protection operation, so sensitive it had haunted federal files for decades. My father's death, the identities, even the cash, It was all part of an effort to bury evidence against a network that had never truly been dismantled. I told him about Thomas, about Angela, about the lies that gutted me in court. Agent Price nodded grimly. They used your own blood to break you down. That's their way now. But Harold, what they didn't count on was you finding the truth before they could erase it. That letter, those journals, they're not just family relics. They're evidence, and evidence is what they fear most. For the first time since the gavel fell in that courtroom, I felt a spark of power inside me. Not wealth, not property, something greater. The truth. I swore then and there that I would use it. Not only to clear my name, but to protect Nancy, my youngest, the one who still called just to hear my voice. She had children of her own, my grandchildren, and I refused to let the shadows that stole my father and poisoned my son touch them. When Agent Price left, promising federal protection and a full review of the materials, I returned to the basement. The safe sat open, the cash and documents spread out like a battlefield. I lowered myself onto the cold floor, the letter trembling in my hands. For a long time, I just stared at my mother's handwriting, her words still echoing. If they come back, it means they've found you. But I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt something closer to resolve. At 68, I no longer cared about retirement plans or what the neighbors thought of me. I cared about truth. I cared about the dignity they had stripped from me in court. And I cared about making sure Nancy and her children never lived under the weight of secrets and lies. So I sat there, an old man in a dusty basement, my mother's letter glowing under the weak light bulb. My hands shook, but my eyes were steady. For the first time in years, I knew exactly who I was. The truth wasn't just my inheritance, it was my weapon, and I was ready to use it.